Hello, it's David and Brent again this week. It's March the 6th, and a lot of things on the list this week for us to cover. Going to start off with a new question we have in the Forecast Network for you to go check out. It's a question on the FDA's. Will the FDA make a decision on blocking the use of dairy terms for non-traditional dairy products, such as plant proteins? It's a great story that you can read and follow up on that. Not something I follow closely, but something a lot of our followers who are really close to the policy side of things really closely watching. A lot of pressure on the FDA, especially coming out of the Senate, to make a move to start to tighten up some of the definitions around what dairy means and how we use that term. Also, out of the policy side, Secretary Sonny Perdue got to testify this week in front of Congress. A couple highlights that I saw from that. The first one was he's on the record less than a 10% chance of an MFP payment in 2020. So Brent, he's down there with you.
Right. Well, I've greatly increased mine when the president made his tweet, and I ramped my forecast up. But what I'm really glad to see, David, is that Secretary Sonny is using probabilistic forecast now.
Yeah.
I just said won't happen, and at least now he's into probabilistic forecasts. I think he's probably underestimating, but that's my opinion.
I think it really. I looked at that and I laughed. I think I was glad to see that he used that. I'm glad to see people asking questions. Framed him into that situation where he had to provide some clear insights. But I think it also goes back to what is his role in that decision-making process. Last year became pretty clear. The decision was coming out of more of the White House and the vice president. It also seemed like last week the USDA was caught off guard by the president tweeting this. And then Sonny Perdue went on in his testimony this week in Congress that, well, the president had this big if statement. If this happens, then this. And so anyway, we got 10%. I'm well above that. I'm around to 50% right now. So we'll see how
where I'm at too now.
Yeah,
which
another
is a great increase over what it was, and I just you got to think there's at least some chance it's going to happen now.
And to follow up on that, Sonny Perdue also doubled down on this a bit and said that he expected China to start buying U.S. soybeans in the spring and summer months, which we're going to follow up with this on an article, and we'll dive into this a little bit more. But as listeners and readers will remember, we wrote an article a few weeks ago. We'll add a link to this in the transcript, where historically speaking, China just doesn't buy U.S. soybeans in the summer months. June, July, August are really low trade months for soybeans. And so that would be a very significant development if that happens. So not only are they buying, soybeans, positive story, but they're also buying them off season, which would be another level of, but we'll look at that more in a future post.
Yeah. Something to definitely watch though, if they start doing it, because it's so contra to how things usually work.
Exactly. One final note on the policy, because it's the forecasting network, sometimes things happen quickly. Brent and I were chatting about this earlier. Our count, and it's not probably completely accurate, we were counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 candidates for the Democratic nomination for the presidential race last Friday when we recorded this, and now they're down to 2. And so sometimes probabilities happen really quickly. Check out the 538 website. We like to follow that a lot, 538.com. And they do a lot of probabilistic forecasting in politics. And there's been interesting to see how quickly their expectations changed really last Saturday. So if you really like the probabilistic forecast, like to apply it to politics, check out that website.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to watch that that race kind of unfold, and it's going to be fun to watch it continue to evolve.
Okay, Brent, the big story this week, I guess the indirect impacts of coronavirus are starting to show up. The Federal Reserve did an emergency rate cut. So talk to us a little bit, Brent, about what you're thinking about when it comes to these interest rate cuts as it applies to the economy and the coronavirus.
Well, I was telling somebody, if you would have asked me a year ago, what is the probability the 10-year treasury goes below 1%, I probably would have been at like 10% or something. And now we're at what? I mean, we went through 0.8 now, David, is that right? Or is it even less?
It's around that 0.8 mark, I think.
Which is really a dramatic decline in intermediate and long-term interest rates. And so there's just lots and lots of moving parts here right now. But, the fear over the coronavirus is clearly causing a lot of change in the macro economy. And, the Fed came out and cut short-term interest rates 50 basis points this week, surprise cut. The market didn't really like it when they did it, I guess, in part because I think everybody's starting to go, well, what do they know that we don't? But when you step back and think about it, I think there's some real questions. Economically, this is a very complicated issue. So a pandemic has elements of supply shock, okay, where and a supply shock results in higher prices, right? So you can't get the goods because people aren't working and not producing them. So it results in higher prices. And typically, you don't want to see the Fed, probably in central banker school, usually in a supply shock situation, you don't cut interest rates because it could ultimately stimulate inflation. But it's also got demand shock elements to it as well, because people aren't out buying stuff either. So it's a very complicated situation. But the end result of all of this is that I think monetary policy is probably going to be pretty ineffective in fixing this situation. And the Fed shooting off, 50 basis points worth of bullets right out of the gate, I think is surprising to me. And because they don't have a lot left. And so it's going to be very interesting to see where all this goes.
So after the Fed did the emergency rate cut, we also saw the White House economic team, the advisors, saying that they're working on the idea of getting Congress to pass a stimulus package, a spending package that might include an infrastructure deal. We haven't heard about a lot of the infrastructure deal. And I guess when I heard that, it reminded me back to your comments is, the problem is we have factories who can't produce the goods, and we have consumers who are sitting at home afraid to go buy goods, right? There's sort of this mixed match. And the idea of potentially this monetary stimulus from the Federal Reserve, and then this stimulus from the government, this fiscal stimulus, and building bridges is probably questionable how effective it is, but also could create some problems when now you have more money chasing goods that are sort of locked up into the supply chain situation. And to follow that up with, no amount of interest rate drop is going to convince somebody who's staying at home to go to the movie theater or to go on a cruise. And so it's a very interesting strategy. It's a very difficult environment, and we're starting to see some strategies come to the forefront that kind of make you scratch your head.
Yeah, it's really this kind of event does not happen very often. Global supply shocks are very rare. And I just think we're in uncharted water. And what I've been telling people is, it's maximum uncertainty right now around even around the virus outbreak. We don't know. We just don't know a lot right now. And so it's just maximum uncertainty. And that's why you're seeing the market, I think, just bounce all over the place. But at the same time, from an ag perspective, we've seen interest rates drop, the dollar strengthen. You look at soybean prices, we were talking earlier, soybean prices out of Brazil are a lot cheaper because the dollar strengthened relative to the real. There is a lot of change happening right now.
And it's hard to look at one or two data points and sort of come to a conclusion and say, this is what's going to happen. Once you start to take in a whole host of data points, you start to quickly understand how they're intertwined and interrelated. Brent and I are working on a different project earlier this week, and we noted, there's really three things that are out there. There's the trade deal that we signed with China. So China's supposed to be coming to buy you more U.S. ag products, and now that's, we were questioning if China could do that to begin with. And we thought that African swine fever, the second big issue in agriculture, could help them reach their goals. But now we have the coronavirus. And so now this is a barrier. And now we have indirect effects of all this, such as interest rates. And everything is sort of convoluted, and direct and indirect effects are coming to the forefront, and we just don't know how any of it's going to play out. And so it's easy to take a look at one thing at a time and sort of an economist ceteris paribus. So this event by itself would have this impact, but how do you look at all of the impacts compounded on top of each other?
It's very complicated, and like I said, just very few analogies with which we can kind of go back and say, oh, this is similar to this situation. This is very unique. We just don't see events like this very often in economics, and so trying to understand it. That I think we should link to that article that Howard Marks wrote about Nobody Knows. It's a really good assessment of it, and I think he does a pretty good job of laying out and saying, we just don't know yet. And I think a good thing is that the uncertainty is, we're going to know a lot more next week and the week after about, you've got the virus side of it, and then you've got the human reaction side to it. And that, those are different, right? I mean, you've got people getting sick, but you've also got how people change their behavior as a result of people getting sick. And that has impacts on economics. It also has impacts on how fast the virus will transmit. And it's just, it's right now, I think it's important to just kind of keep your head and try and be as rational as possible, which is hard in this environment.
I saw a tweet that I liked, and we could link to it in the transcript. It says, two things can be true with respect to coronavirus. One, the coronavirus will spread widely. And two, a lot of people are more scared than they have any reason to be. These people have an exaggerated sense of their own personal risk. And I think that's a very good way of summarizing it. It seems like we have two groups out there. One side arguing like, oh, it's going to be really, really, really bad. And the other side saying like, oh, no, it's it's just fear driven. But I think both of those statements can be true. And like you mentioned, Brent, the fear is actually going to impact how the disease spreads. And so no one can sort of walk out and say, aha, the disease didn't hit this threshold, so therefore it was all fear driven. It's like, well, actually, people's fears change their behaviors, which then impacted how much of the spread it was. One thing we know for certain is that the disease could have been a lot worse without these people, without humans changing their behavior. So
yeah, it's like that old Bernanke quote about economics and how people react to prices and other things, and it changes the situation. And so I think it's just very true.
Yes, he was analogy, and I'll include it. We usually talk about this when it comes to the planting report. So it's sort of a March quote. We talk about this for the planting report because a lot of times the planting intentions report, which comes out at the end of the month, people say, oh, its error is huge compared to what actually happens. But the point of the report is to change human behaviors. And so the report comes out, prices change, and then we have final planting. And this is also a scenario here. So he talks about in the quote, forecasting the weather is just physics. It's how the particles interact with each other. With economics, we have not only how the particles interact with each other, but also the humans are anticipating how things are going to interact with each other. And that also impacts the final outcome. And that's a very good to remember here. Is anything else you're keeping an eye on this week coming up, Brent?
No, I just think, watching that very carefully. We got final crop insurance prices. We'll have some articles out about that. And so I'm trying to, I think everybody's just trying to sort out what all this uncertainty means. And that's what I'm watching most right now.
Before we wrap up, I have one interesting, random but relevant article to share. We included this in the weekly email. Interesting story about a man who got 99 cell phones in Germany. I believe it was in Germany, and put them in a little red wagon and started pulling them around the city. And what happened was he ended up tricking Google Maps, and Google Maps ends up showing all these traffic jams as he was walking down these streets, and it started rerouting people, and so people started changing their driving behaviors. And we talk a lot about how do you go from data and create knowledge, insights, implication, and actions. And it was a really interesting story about how this man had these cell phones, and these cell phones were sharing data, which then Google and Google Maps was creating insights from, or they thought they were creating insights from, and they were making recommendations, and then people's actions were being altered by this. And so they interviewed the man, and he said that his goal was to highlight the quote unquote blindness that arises when people think of data as objective, unambiguous, and interpretation free. And so sometimes data can not be exactly what we think it is.
Right. Really important to use your judgment.
So if you're ever driving around and you say there's a traffic jam, you should look for the man in the wagon and see if he's causing problems. So, all right. Well, that's all we have for this week. I look for more content to be shared. As always, reach out if you have any questions, thoughts, ideas, and we'll look forward to chatting with you next week. Thanks.
Thank you.